Welcome back to the most accurate podcast here at 4for4 Football. As always, I'm your host, John Daigle. Joined today, the man himself, friend in life. It is John Paulson. Paulson, how's it going?
It's going pretty good. I'm going to be gone for the next 2 weeks, trip to Europe. So kind of getting my ducks in a row here for that trip. But happy to be here to talk about a couple of underappreciated facets of fantasy football, the offensive line and defense.
The shows will go on, for better or worse, without you, but we will get to those guests in the ensuing weeks. Right now, I actually want to start off with a bit of OTA news before we dive into your recent pieces on 4for4.com. And I think that begins with DeAndre Hopkins outright being released by the Cardinals. And I want to start with the Cardinals section of this because Kyler Murray, we didn't even get to see him on the field with both players. Only 30 pass attempts, 7.5% of his pass attempts last year came with both Marquise Brown and Hopkins on the field. Yes, what I've seen from everyone so far is discussing Marquise Brown's fantasy points as the wide receiver 6 through week 6 without Hopkins last year. But also, Paulson, I struggle to make that connection. I don't want to extrapolate those splits because all those games came with Kyler Murray, whereas we are thinking we're getting Colt McCoy and or Clayton Tune for a majority, if not all of the season. So go ahead and discuss what you think will happen with this Cardinals offense now and Marquise Brown in particular.
Yeah, I'm assuming Kyler plays, I think, half the season. Mm-hmm. And I've seen some doctor arguments, PT arguments on Twitter with the guys in the white coats are battling it out, trying to figure out what his outlook looks like. Yeah. We've got a lot of history of ACL tears for quarterbacks and they tend to come back, but it's kind of a special case because he's, running such a big part of his game and his athleticism is a big part of his game. So I'm interested to see where he ends up, but I'm starting to get a little bit more bullish on him appearing before midseason. So that being said, Colt McCoy is a decent backup. When this news broke about Hopkins being outright released, it was surprising because he's pretty talented and they couldn't figure out a way to trade him for anything. But my initial reaction is yes, Marquise Brown moves way up from maybe the mid 40s up to right now I have him at 21 and half PPR. Rondale Moore is going to get on the field. I think a little bit more. His floor is raised as well. And then you're kind of looking at guys like Greg Dortch, although Dortch is I think he's more of a slot guy with more. Did better with more sidelines. So I'm interested to see, in 3 receiver sets in camp, because they got Zach Pascal too, Michael Wilson, Auden Tate, Javonte Williams. So we're getting into some deep names there. So I do think that Marquise Brown is the biggest bump of this crew. You can maybe make an argument like a Trey McBride if Zach Ertz is out, we'll have a breakout season. But obviously there's some quarterback issues there. Kyler Murray's status will drive this offense, whether or not they can even remain competitive for the first half of the season if Kyler Murray is out, and then why are they rushing Kyler Murray back if they're 1-7 or something like that. So it's going to be an interesting year in Arizona for sure. Interesting
is one way to put it. You mentioned that Marquise Brown is your wide receiver 21. On Underdog, however, he's currently going as a wide receiver 35. So I think we need to play a name game now, trying to figure out how much his ADP is going to adjust. So let's go ahead and start with that range you mentioned, wide receiver 21 to 25, right? The low end wide receiver 2s. And let's say, would you draft Keenan Allen or Marquise Brown?
Keenan Allen. I have him at 16.
Drake London or Marquise Brown?
Marquise Brown. But if this ADP is what it is, I know I can get Marquise Brown later. So there's no reason to reach for him. If I think I can get both London and Marquise Brown by just taking London first, that's a smart thing to do, knowing that his ADP is whatever you said, wide receiver 35.
So right now, I think what you are getting at is we should probably be drafting him anywhere from 57 to 60 ADP, around and in between Chris Godwin, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and Brandon Ayuk, because that would still give us a full round in ranking ahead of where he's currently going.
Yes. I think he's vastly undervalued if he's going wide receiver 35 still. I mean, is this the last 2 or 3 days of ADP?
This is the last 7 days of ADP.
Okay, so we'll see where it lands in a couple days. But right now, that's just I think that's vastly underrating his value right now.
Let's get to the other side of this deal, and DeAndre Hopkins, who reportedly has his choices whittled down to Buffalo and Kansas City. And by the sound of it, the Chiefs are offering more money. So I'm just assuming that's where he's going to sign. Right now, Hopkins is going as the wide receiver 19 overall, ADP 39, right behind Amari Cooper and Deebo Samuel, just ahead of Christian Watson. And I also think his ADP hasn't set in, because I'm guessing he becomes a top 30 pick with everyone assuming he lands with Patrick Mahomes. Right now, for instance, DK Metcalf, 29th ADP overall, Calvin Ridley, 33. I can see Hopkins settling into that zone. So let's just assume Hopkins were to sign with the Chiefs. Where would you have him ranked then?
It's an interesting quandary between those two teams as to like which team would he have a better fantasy value with. And I was thinking initially, it'll be the Chiefs because they don't really have an entrenched wide receiver one, but they do have Travis Kelce. And then you look at the Bills, and they have an entrenched receiver one with Diggs. So, which team would you rather have him join if you're looking to upside, for his upside? And I guess I would say the Chiefs because, there are wide receiver targets and there are tight end targets, and there are some targets that overlap that could go to either player or either position. But, there's some routes that Kelce doesn't run. So I think I'd rather have him go to the Chiefs. And obviously one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time in Patrick Mahomes. So where does he land? I think, I had him in that wide receiver 18, wide receiver 22 range, I believe, before the release. I think he probably would be in that 16 to 18 range there with Keenan Allen, Deebo Samuel, Terry McLaurin, maybe a little bit higher to kind of see how he does. And, it was interesting to see, the report that the executives are kind of NFL executives are souring on his ability to separate. Yet, Matt Harmon at Reception Perception still had him solidly above average. The open score, wide receiver open score over at ESPN Analytics had him solidly above average. So he's still able to get open. It's not like he's fallen off a cliff or anything. He was pretty productive last year when he was healthy.
Does this do anything to Travis Kelce's ADP for you? Right now, for example, my best ball tiers are on the site where I'm taking both a micro stance on players with the rankings, but more importantly, trying to explain big picture views of why I'm taking these players in their ranges. And so I'm not trying to poke holes in Travis Kelce. Of course, I still value him as a top 5, top 6 pick universally. But if we were to try to sell someone on backing off Kelce, I do think it's actually an easy explanation in not only being 34 years old this season, but also last year, he was only the 9th tight end since 2008, many seasons, to average over 15 points per game. Whereas the tight end 2 through 12 behind him, that was the first time that range averaged fewer than 9 points per game since 2008. So think about if we had an outlier season at tight end 1 overall and also outlier seasons lower than that from tight end 2 through 12, and these points and players are suddenly going to meet in the middle with a little bit of regression, then maybe that tells us we should be waiting on tight end and instead valuing those lower end tight end ones that can maybe match him or at least come closer, because Travis Kelce may not dominate the field. That's the way I'm looking at it anyways. But your thoughts on Travis Kelce if Hopkins were to sign there?
I don't think it hurts him a whole lot, but it does affect him. I mean, I think Tyreek Hill when he was last with the Chiefs was more of a fantasy factor, more of a real world factor than Hopkins will be this year. They are hurting at receiver, I would say. Like they're just the rest of the receivers are the ones that are really going to take a push down. I mean, Kadarius Toney, MVS, Sky Moore, etc. But Kelce, there are like these slight warning signs heading into last season, but then his red zone activity increased, and he had one of his best seasons ever. I still think that the advantage that he gives you at tight end, unless you are looking at perhaps Baltimore and saying a pass-heavy Ravens or a pass-heavier Ravens attack really could lead to a Mark Andrews explosion, or you're, looking at TJ Hawkinson at the end of the 4th round and loving those 8.5 targets that he averaged after coming over to Minnesota. If you are high on one, or George Kittle. So if you're high on one of those guys and you're like, you know what, I'm going to pass on Kelsey in the middle of the first, draft a receiver or running Bijan or somebody, or Eckler, and target one of these tight ends later, I understand it, because there is now a bigger disparity in the ADPs between Kelsey and the field than there was, I think, last year. I think last year we were looking at a couple tight ends there in the 2nd, Pitts in the 3rd, so the ADPs are starting to spread out as well, and that might create a market inefficiency in the TE2, through TE4 spots or TE5 spots in the ADPs.
Andrews currently being drafted as the tight end 2, of course, did average the 2nd most fantasy points per game among tight ends last year in his 11 starts with Lamar Jackson. Also, it is Andrews, to your point, not Kelsey, who has led all tight ends in end zone targets the last 2 years. Another bit of news we got out of nowhere this past week was Jimmy Garoppolo failing his physical after he reportedly underwent foot surgery. Seems like a piece of news we shouldn't have missed out on, that the team should have mentioned earlier, but underwent foot surgery when he signed with the Raiders back in May. And if you could count the red flags in this recent report, quote, the sense is that the team is confident he'll be ready to play by the start of the regular season, unquote. And I think, Paulson, that just gets us back to discussing Davante Adams, currently going as the wide receiver 8 and underdog, as the very last pick in the 1st round. What are you doing now, given that we should maybe expect either Brian Hoyer or day 3 quarterback Aiden O'Connell to start week 1?
Yeah, this is when this news broke. We talked about Davante, I think, on the podcast a week or 2 ago, and I think I had him at 6, and I moved him down to 9 at this point, and I moved Josh Jacobs down as well. I'm a little worried now about this entire offense functioning and how functional it'll be with either a gimpy Garoppolo. He might end up being healthy and being able to manage the games for the Raiders, but certainly some red flags here. And I don't think Tom Brady's going to come out of retirement. I think he needs approval. If he wants to be the part owner of the Raiders and come out of retirement, he needs the approval of everybody, all the other owners. I think that's correct. I don't know what you think the chances of Brady playing are. But it's really the quarterback situation behind Garoppolo is pretty dire. I mean, you do have Hoyer, who is experienced, but he could probably get a wide receiver 1 season out of Davante, but not a sure thing. Like if it were Garoppolo or an Aaron Rodgers or Tom Brady or somebody like that. So I'm just worried about the offense as a whole now. And I think the Raiders are a little bit suspect now until we know more about Garoppolo's foot, because we just don't know who's going to be playing quarterback for him. It's such a driving force on offense.
How far did you recently move down Josh Jacobs? Because he has been not only mine, but a lot of people's favorite selection in the 3rd round, because so far in drafts, that's allowed you to start 2 strong wide receivers and then go Jacobs as your anchor RB in the 3rd.
I think 3rd round's still really good value. I moved him from 2 to 6, which is pretty significant in my rankings, but I was very high on him to start the offseason. So I still think he's going to see a huge workload. I just am now worried about the touchdown opportunities and, drive sustaining opportunities, because if you have a questionable quarterback, then, you're going to have fewer touches from your running back.
Another player going in that 3rd round range is Breece Hall, and Robert Saleh recently came out and said he's very optimistic Breece Hall will play in week 1. There were a few different Jets reporters also suggesting that Hall won't be ready for OTA. So it seems like September is the timeline here. On that same note, though, in going in the 3rd round, Breece Hall is currently being drafted as the RB11 overall, right ahead of Travis Etienne as a top 30 pick. So does this move the needle for you at all in drafting Hall in that range?
Well, I think it was interesting. I saw the tweet that said that he had hit 22 miles per hour in the GPS tracking. And it's not often we get, because with this, you call it the ready for week 1 or on track for week 1 season in spring. Yeah. So it's not often, though, that we actually get data that actually backs up what they're saying. Now, is somebody just saying that he's hit 22 miles per hour, or is this is something that should be easily checkable, but maybe not. It's nice to have that data to say, okay, he is running really fast. That must mean he's feeling pretty good. Probably not cutting on the knee at all yet. But the way that Javonte Williams has come back and is in OTAs, albeit with a knee brace and everything, it just seems like Breece Hall should be ready to go week 1. And if he's really running that fast, I feel pretty confident about him being ready to go at the start of the season. Now, I mean, he may not be 100%, may not see his full complement of touches first couple of weeks, first few weeks of September. But, by midseason, he should be a full go.
I'm still slightly skeptical of the injury, given that ADP. I don't mind being behind the field if I'm assuming he won't be healthy, but if he's healthy, obviously it's the ideal situation he was plopped into last year. Had a higher ADOT than most running backs as he led all running backs with 21 air yards per game. And then also remember his share of the team's backfield touches only increased, got higher and the last 5 games prior to suffering October's torn ACL. So the workload, at least we know, will be right if in fact he's healthy, but that's still a major if. Another tight end, one we were trying to jam up there alongside the other elite options, is Darren Waller. And Giants OC Mike Kafka came out at OTAs and said that basically they're trying to use Waller around every inch of the field now that they've seen him as a player. Quote, he makes you defend really all the depth of the field and the width of the field. He can get over the second level and work second level defenders. He can get to the third level because he has tremendous athletic ability and speed. TJ Hernandez has a profile on Waller up on the site. And as he notes as well, Waller's 16% target share with Davante Adams last year in the Raiders. We try to overlook that since 2019 to 2021, Waller had a 25% target share and was proven to be an elite tight end option. So do you have faith in a Waller bounce back in this Giants offense?
Yeah, for me, it's a great situation for him to land in. The receiver room is not too impressive. There's as many targets available for him as almost any tight end in the league in terms of target share if he's healthy. And that's the big question. Is he going to be healthy? He had back-to-back 16-game seasons in 2019, 2020. It's when he went over 1,100 yards both seasons. And then in 2021, he only played 11 games. And then last year, 2022, he played 9 games and had a disappointing season with Davante. But there's nobody like Davante in that Giants receiving core. So I think he has a great chance of being the number 1 target in that offense passing attack. And in that case, he's a value, but you have to take into account his injury history and whether or not you trust him to be out there for 15, 16 games, because that's what we're hoping for from your tight end, is that they are out there for most of the season. He's just turned 30. He's turning 31 in September. So that's the only red flag I see for Waller heading into the season, is that injury history.
And not that we're chasing floor options at his ADP, although his ADP compared to Kyle Pitts, T.J. Hawkinson, others who haven't shown us ceiling, is definitely an easy pill to swallow. At the same time, though, remember, the way they used Waller, the Raiders last year, was so odd just in allowing him to lead his position and depth of target, 14.5-yard depth of target from a quarterback, Derek Carr, who has historically been a terrible deep passer. So, of course, it's no wonder why his production failed altogether last year. So if we're now bringing him closer to the line of scrimmage and focusing the offense around him on every level of the field, I do think Waller, if he stays healthy, can easily lead the Giants in targets, which is why I'm so high on him this year. And finally, Jennifer Eakins has a piece on the site right now explaining why Antonio Gibson is her favorite 0 RB target if you fall into that strategy. And Ron Rivera recently came out and said that Gibson, quote, has really shown his pass catching abilities, unquote, in OTAs. Now, why it took until the 4th year of OTAs having Gibson, I'll never understand, Paulson, to see that Gibson, who of course was a wide receiver at Memphis, suddenly has pass catching chops. But at the same time, remember, whenever they lost J.D. McKissick over the second half of the season, Gibson averaged fewer targets per game. They instead just handed Brian Robinson over 18 touches per game to be an every down back. Robinson, of course, who is egregiously offensively for fantasy football, being drafted behind James Cook, and I'm still upset about it. But anyways, your thoughts on the Washington backfield under Eric Bieniemy this year, Paulson?
Are you saying that Robinson's being drafted too high?
I am saying that he needs
Or
to
too
be
low?
significantly higher. Yes.
Okay.
The fact that you could have little single-digit touch James Cook over Brian Robinson literally
Yeah.
offends me.
Yeah. I wanted to highlight a tweet by a friend of the show, Ian Hartitz, who tweeted
He
today.
tweets? No way.
Antonio Gibson, NFL career, 2020, Ron Rivera says he has a skill set similar to Christian McCaffrey. 2021, Kyle Allen says Gibson will have a similar role as CMC. 2022, starting kick returner. And 2023, Rivera is impressed by Gibson, the former collegiate receiver, in the passing game.
Mm-hmm.
So we've come full circle in terms of the coach speak. All joking aside, I've always been a fan of Gibson and his game, but the fact that they brought in Brian Robinson and gave him the RB1 role last year makes you a little bit nervous about him. But I do prefer Gibson in PPR formats to Robinson due to that. I think he is a talented guy. I think the issue seems to be maybe ball security, maybe some goal line ability between Gibson and Robinson. But so you think that Robinson is the clear RB1 in Washington, or how do you think this breakdown?
Not that it would affect me drafting Gibson at his current ADP, because basically you're getting him as an RB4 or 5, depending on your build. But absolutely Robinson. That's who they entrusted last year after he was shot in the leg and missed the first month of the season, basically.
Yeah.
Just to hand him that workload. Oh, yeah. I think Robinson, not to say again that he'll lead the backfield in touches, but after Gibson handled a career low in touches last year in a season they didn't have J.D. McKissic for half the year, yeah, I definitely think Brian Robinson is the first option. But then maybe Gibson does play himself into a third down role.
Yeah, and he's good enough to produce in 6 to 8 carries and 4 or 5 catches. So if they actually do give him the J.D. McKissic type role, then he could outscore Robinson, Robinson's kind of a zero in the passing game. But he is more likely to surpass 200 carries. I definitely agree with that.
And he's the type of player I like to tack on in those later rounds in May and June. I'll probably have a different stance since we have to take harder leans for redraft, those home leagues come August, since we'll have the most information. But right now, we're just talking about profiles and the archetype of players we chase. Of course, I'll draft Gibson. Yeah, I don't hate it at all. But Brian Robinson should still be ranked higher. Not by you, but everyone is egregiously pushing them down the board. Most importantly, though, Paulson, you also have 2 pieces on the site for everyone. That's why we're here today to discuss both an offensive line article discussing the money that teams invested in their trenches this offseason, and also one on defense. So I will let you take it away, and I'll just chip in wherever you'd like me to.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the units that maybe I'm going to discuss. But I started doing this 5 years or so ago, and I haven't seen anybody else do this type of analysis, and I think it's an interesting way to look at hard to quantify aspect of fantasy football. We know that offensive lines really do help their running backs and their quarterbacks and receivers and the offense as a whole. We know that bad offensive lines can submarine an otherwise good running back or appealing fantasy season if there's an injury or two across the offensive line, or they just don't play well, or they lost some talent in free agency. And this basically assumes that the free agent market is pretty efficient, and that a player, whatever he gets in free agency, equates to his talent and his impact on the offensive line. So I look at the net money in and the net money out, and I also add in the draft picks, high capital draft picks that the team used in the first 3 rounds on the offensive line to try to see which teams might be able to offset some of their losses in free agency. But what I found was Denver, 5 years that I've been tracking this data, no team has spent more in the offseason than the Denver Broncos did this year. The net $23.6 million was slightly more than the net $23.1 that the Bills spent in 2019. The Bills' offensive line improved. I look at adjusted line yards, adjusted sack rate over at Football Outsiders to try to measure a team's improvement or getting worse on the offensive line. They got Mike McGlinchey Ben Powers. They got a good rush. McGlinchey's better in rush blocking, and Powers is better in pass blocking. So both aspects of the offensive line should be better, and that bodes well for Russell Wilson and Javonte Williams. Another team that I think continues to invest, the Bengals. Last year, they spent $20.6 million. They spent another net of $17.1 million, adding Orlando Brown. They did have a big drop in their adjusted sack rate last year, so they were protecting Joe Burrow better. It didn't really pay off a whole lot in the running game, but since the offensive line continues to improve, and we were just talking about the Commanders, they shored up their offensive line by spending $11.4 million. Andrew Wiley, tackle, guard Nick Gates, and they added a third-round center. So this offensive line should look a little different. They were kind of bottom 10 last year in the metrics that I look at. So those were the three that invested in a major way, and the other one that was interesting to me was the Steelers, who really could have. They were already 10th in adjusted line yards, 12th in adjusted sack rate last year. And then they added last year they spent the third most. This year they spent the fourth most, $10.7 million, adding guard Isaac Seumalo and Nate Herberg. And then they added, of course, Broderick Jones, which probably is the biggest addition for them. So, Najee Harris is kind of going later maybe than he should. I don't know, talent-wise, is he up there with the top 8 or 9 backs in the fantasy ranks? I don't know. But certainly I think he's going to have a big workload, and this offensive line should be terrific. And if we're following touches and with a good offensive line, then Najee Harris should be a surprisingly good fantasy asset this year.
Steelers also adding massive tight end Darnell Washington, one of the nation's best blocking tight ends at 6'7", 265 pounds as well. So I agree with you. Definitely an offense I keep buying low into, not to mention everyone basically due for regression from the horrific results they had through the air. But even just look at someone as simple as Deontay Johnson. 833 wide receivers have recorded 110 targets in the Super Bowl era. And Deontay Johnson was literally the only one of them to not record a touchdown last year. That tells you alone that, of course, we think they're coming. Pat Freiermuth also was one of 15 tight ends last year with 69 targets, at least 69. And his 2 touchdowns were the fewest among those 15. So it's all starting to boil over, especially when you mention the improvements of the offensive line, that this is a team, Kenny Pickett included, to buy it low into and to stack for this year. Also on your point.
Oh, I was just going to add, didn't know if you wanted to move on to defense, but I wanted to mention 2 of the teams that lost a lot of salary, lost a lot of talent in free agency. The Eagles had the biggest net loss, 17.7 along the offensive line, but they lost Andre Dillard, Isaac Seumalo, both good players. But Dillard only played in 7 games, so it wasn't a huge impact. He wasn't a huge impact on the offense last season. They drafted Tyler Steen in the 3rd round. So they do have, I went and looked at their depth, and they do have some pretty good depth there ready to step in. So I think the Eagles will be able to weather the free agency storm better than most teams. The other one that jumped out was the 49ers, who just get killed in free agency again this year. Mm-hmm. They lost $15.6 million last year, and they lost another $16.9 million this year. Mike McGlinchey, as I mentioned earlier, moved on. Daniel Brunskill moved on. It might start to bite them, but they did sign John Feliciano, Matt Pryor, but these guys were not highly regarded free agents in terms of salary. So they need to continue to coach well and hope that their younger players can step up for them to maintain their top 10 ranking in both adjusted line yards and adjusted sack rate.
It was so weird because they had an NFL high, the 49ers, 7 compensatory picks. And even then, They basically leaned on their recency bias, the luck they had in falling into Jake Brendel, who was an amazing replacement for Alex Mack last year. But they basically told themselves, we can do that again. We can just replace anyone on the offensive line. So to have that many picks and then literally not draft Mike McGlinchey's replacement, instead pinning everything most likely on Matt Pryor or most likely Colton McKivitz, it was an odd thing to do, especially because remember, they traded up for a freaking kicker. So I don't quite understand it. Kyle Shanahan, to his defense, has historically been very good at masking offensive linemen and quarterbacks in his scheme. So maybe it doesn't matter in the end anyways. I also just wanted to hit on Russell Wilson. You mentioned, of course, Sean Payton showing up and prioritizing immediately the offensive line. Also adding arguably the best blocking tight end and Chris Manhertz in free agency too. So it's clear what Peyton's trying to do, but more importantly, Russell Wilson career lows last year in completion percentage, touchdown rate, and fantasy points per game. You would think we at least have one more year of something similar to prime Wilson under Peyton. It's a very small sample, but I just genuinely can't get over, even though everyone tuned out by this time, I can't get over the fact that Nathaniel Hackett was fired and then Russell Wilson finished as the QB2 and QB3 in week 17 and 18. I can't ignore it, even the small sample. So it sucks me back in, and I keep drafting Wilson anyways.
Yeah, Wilson is interesting, dude, because he's so, he's being drafted so late.
Yeah.
He's going QB 18. Like, just get your head around that. This is a perennial top 12, top 10, top 12 guy. Even in his down years, he was a QB1. And a lot of the things are lining up really well for him. Sean Payton and fixing the coaching issue. We know he's good. Offensive line is going to be better. He's got some good receivers. They got a good pass catching tight end. This is shaping up to be a bounce back year for him, and you can get him really late. He's going pick 129 right now.
What were some of your takeaways from your defensive spending piece?
Yeah, so it's very similar process that I use. Go to Spot Track, the great site that has all the free agency signings, and I use my pivot table magic to get these net in, net out. Instead of offensive line where it's just offensive linemen, this is the whole defense. So this is really, we're looking at fantasy defense, and I've found that teams that have invested at least $7 million on defense in a given year have enjoyed an average increase in fantasy scoring of 20% the following year. It's not universal. It's not going to happen every time, but in general, if a team is over $7 million in net spending, they improve their scoring by 20% on average. So this year, the top one was Atlanta, 41.7 million. So they may be able to take a jump, but they were pretty bad last year. Certainly not a team I'm looking at to rank in the top 12 or anything as far as a team you'd want to draft, but they might be in the streaming conversation if things come together with this talent that they added. Chicago was second with 26.7 million net in. Again, not a great team, fantasy team last year. I think they might've been dead last in our fantasy scoring at 4 for 4. Let me double check that. I'd love to point out when the Bears were last in something. Yes, they were dead last in scoring 4.6 fantasy points. They could, improve greatly off of that, but it's still not going to make them necessarily a, every week starter. But the teams that are interesting to me that showed up in the top 4 are Cleveland, a net of 26 million in, and Seattle, a net of 25.1 million in. Both of those teams finished inside the top 11 in fantasy scoring last year. The Browns were 8th. They already had a good unit. So what I like to see is a team in that, 5 to 15 range that's spending a lot of money on the defensive side of the ball. Maybe they make that leap into the top 5 or top 8 in terms of defensive fantasy scoring, because now we're going over to FFPC or wherever we can draft defenses, and we can get these guys really quite a bit later than where they really should be going based on the talent level. They had a defensive tackle, Dalvin Tomlinson, Juan Thornhill, and I'm not even going to try this defensive end, Okwo or Rowan Quo. I guess I did try it. 6.3 million for him. They didn't use a pick in the draft in the first 3 rounds on a defensive player, so that's the one maybe mark against them. But I think the Browns should be improved from the 8th place finish they finished last year. So I think take that into account when you're when you're seeing them as, I don't know where they're even going in their ADP. I don't think they're very high. And then the Seahawks, number 11 fantasy scoring. I think that surprises people when I mention that. Like, I was looking at the Seahawks figuring they were 15 to 20 range last year, but they were actually number 11. They got Devin Witherspoon in the first round, outside linebacker Derek Hall, but they added $25 million in salary, and the big one was Draymond Jones, $17.2 million. They also added Julian Love. They got Bobby Wagner and Jaron Reed from the Packers. So this unit should be improved as well. So those are a couple of the lower, maybe echelon fantasy defenses that I'm going to start looking at drafting. And the other couple of interesting ones are the Lions and the Panthers. They were more middle of the road, the 18th and 15th in scoring, respectively, but they both showed up there at number 6 in spending with Detroit and number 7 in defensive spending with Carolina. But I think I probably have a little bit more confidence in Detroit because I do like to draft fantasy defenses on teams with good offenses, because I think the good offenses tend to put the defense in good positions to get sacks, to get return touchdowns, etc. So I would kind of lean Detroit there. They've been a bad fantasy defense for a long time, but they're one that could make a significant leap as well heading into 2023.
Going back to your assessment of the Falcons, I also think that's why our own Sharp Clark in the betting Discord at 4-4 for everyone has mentioned the Falcons as a divisional winner at long odds, because not only for David Onyemata and Caden Ellis, off-ball linebacker, to follow Ryan Nielsen from New Orleans to Atlanta, so they're familiar with their scheme, but also for that defense to quietly add Calais Campbell, who I understand only 5.5 sacks last year, but when healthy has been a proven commodity. And also, despite 5.5 sacks, Atlanta only totaled 21.5 last season, so that certainly helps. And quietly adding Jesse Bates, arguably the league's best run defensive safety, to this mix. Yeah, their defense in the weakest division in football is very improved. So I know people like to highlight the Saints and their additions, but I think the Falcons and Panthers are significantly better teams than the Saints this season. And of course, the Bucs are just in the Caleb Williams competition and lottery at the end of the year. So do like those in the mix. And then another one you didn't mention, I know I've mentioned this on the past as shows as well, but I keep, like the Steelers, going back to the Rams offense. Just the fact that that team is arguably a nothing on defense. 71% of their defensive players are rookies at this time. Also, last year's unit was the first under Sean McVay to average less than 62 plays per game and a lower rate than 60% pass play rate from neutral game script. So we're going to get, we assume anyways, more volume, both in plays and passing through the air. And it's something I want to be a part of, whether it's Cooper Kupp being undervalued, given that he averaged a position high 33% target share and over 20 fantasy points per game in his 8 full starts with Matthew Stafford, whether it's Matthew Stafford just regressing last year, but now we're getting double discounted this season. You mentioned that you're really high on Tyler Higbee. So that's another offense I keep coming back to and just want pieces of as everyone is down on them.
Yeah, if you look at the Rams, they finished 27th. They're very disappointing finish fantasy-wise for that defense. I mean, they've been kind of overrated the last couple of years, but not only did they finish 27th in fantasy scoring, they lost a net of 7 defensive players in free agency last year. So they just got decimated in free agency. They did draft a couple of players in the first 3 rounds to try to shore up their defense, but it's pretty ugly. They were the third. They lost the third most salary, $22.4 million. New Orleans lost the second most salary, $29.7 million. That's another defense that has traditionally been pretty good. The Saints, and fantasy wise is tanking. And then again, the Eagles got killed, $31.1 million, but they drafted 3 players in the draft in the first 3 rounds. Jalen Carter in the first round to replace Javon Hargrave. They drafted safety Sidney Brown in the 3rd round to help replace Gardner Johnson and Marcus Epps. And they also added Nolan Smith, linebacker, in the 2nd round. So when teams do that, and I see them at the bottom, in terms of how much salary, or the top of how much salary they lost, but they reload in the draft, I feel a little more confident that they're going to be able to sort of maintain their fantasy scoring, or at least stay close to it. maybe improve upon it, but maybe not too big of a hit when they are filling the needs that they lose in free agency. And the Eagles got killed in both offensive line and defensive free agency spending this year.
And that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that Jalen Hurts and the Eagles offense will falter. That just tells me they may struggle a bit more, which keeps their opponents in games. Thus, we're going to get much more volume from them. And that's what we want for fantasy. As Brother Roz even mentions in the chat, how much production increase compares with schedule. This is something that the great Warren Sharp of Sharp Football has done close analysis of. And for example, I understand it's only 1 year, but last season, the top 7 teams that were projected with the league's easiest schedules based on Vegas season win totals. So based on what Vegas is aligning their season win totals at before the year, 6 of those 7 teams made the playoffs. Maybe it was for an easier schedule. Maybe it's because their offense was good. But either way, I like to look at those extremes. And that's what we're trying to do right now, just to get ahead of what happened from last year, since the reason we'll always have a job, Paulson, is because everyone drafts last year's stats. That's not our job. So we're in good shape, brother. And you can check out, for instance, for Dallas's offense. I'm a little more down on it than a lot of people, understanding they are more top heavy this year on paper, but I write about that and more schedule analysis in my best ball tiers on the site. What else do you have for everyone before you go on vacation and leave me?
I have the defensive article. I have the offensive line article. During my vacation, I'm going to be staying on top of the rankings. I think we might be putting in a red alert system if something happens where there's a call chain, a calling tree that gets to me, so that I know instantly when DeAndre Hopkins is signed, and I can run to my phone or run to my computer and update the rankings for that over the next couple of weeks. But not a whole lot happens in June, and that's one of the reasons I take my vacation during this time, and I'll be ready when we get back mid-June, really, for the start. For me, once July 4th hits, we're really getting into the heavy fantasy season. But certainly with best ball and everything else going on, Scott Fishbowl, that things are starting to pick up in late June. So I'll be back for that.
More articles free as well for everyone on the site, and the shows and content you don't get on the podcast feed are also on the 4for4 YouTube page. So stay tuned. I will be back next week with a guest in your place, Paulson, live at 12:30 p.m. Eastern every Wednesday, in fact. So until then, be a little bit kinder than what's required. We'll see you next time.